So looking at the spinal cord, nerves, and reflexes, so we'll talk about first starting off with looking at the systems of the nervous system. So remember, we have the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Central nervous system, if we think about the anatomy part, we can break it up into the brain and spinal cord. Functionally, the central nervous system is involved with integrating information and sending a response out. The peripheral nervous system is involved with inputting information or taking information in and sending it to the central nervous system, so sensory input, and then also carrying out some of those instructions from the central nervous system, right? So if we think about, the general flow of information, right? So we get information coming in from various receptors. That's going to be part of the peripheral nervous system, so sensory input. And then that's going to be sent for integration in the central nervous system, and that could be spinal cord, it could be the brain. And then that's going to assemble some sort of response based upon all of this sensory information that got accumulated in the central nervous system. So that could be some sort of motor output, and, so if we're talking about skeletal muscle, we're talking about the somatic nervous system, and then here, if we're talking about some of the more responses that are automatically done without our consciously knowing about it, so that's going to be more the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and so we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system in a later time as well. In fact, I think I have that just before we talk about the brain. All right? And so remember, the general information flow is that we have to have sensory information coming in, it gets integrated, then we have a response to that information. That's going to really help you understand how some of the anatomy and function, is organized, with respect to the central nervous system, especially the spinal cord. Okay. So, like I said, the central nervous system, if we think about the anatomy, we have the central nervous system, which is including the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is going to be the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves, and basically anything outside or any type of neurons that originate or are part of or extending outside of the spinal cord or the brain, which includes the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Okay? And so remember, the central nervous system is involved with integration, and the peripheral nervous system is sending information out and then carrying out any type of, or executing really any type of plan that was generated by the central nervous system. Right? So here, the peripheral nervous system is taking information out, information into the central nervous system, and then you're getting, an execution out that was generated, a plan that was generated by the central nervous system. All right? Okay. So here, like I said, we'll discuss the brain in all its, different parts at a little bit later date, and then the spinal cord. So looking at the sections, the coverings in the gray matter and white matter is what we're going to look at, right? So, things to think about. Hopefully you guys remember from 231, maybe you discussed the difference between gray and white matter, all right? So what makes it white versus gray? And we'll review that briefly. So if we look at sections of the spinal cord, we can break them up into roughly 4 sections: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, as we go from, superior to inferior. And so you can see that these sections correspond also to the vertebral sections that we have in the spinal cord. And so the nerves that come from the spinal cord exit between the vertebrae, and those spinal nerves. All right, we'll talk about each one. Some you don't have to know the peripheral nerves; they really can be fairly complicated. Right? Not surprisingly, a lot of these are going to be related, and some of them come together so that we sometimes are going to talk about cervical versus thoracic and lumbar, and then the sacral kind of mesh together in some cases. So realize that, there's a lot more going on with these spinal nerves than what we're going to be talking about. All right. So the covering for the actual spinal cord, all right, there's 3 different layers. All of these together are called meninges. This covering also extends to the brain. So the brain also has these 3 coverings that are called meninges. And they're there to help protect the spinal cord. Some of these coverings are going to be more closely associated with the surrounding bone. Some of these coverings are going to be more closely associated with the underlying tissue, the nervous tissue. So if we start with the outermost layer, that's called the dura mater, right? So the dura mater, so you can see it here. And so this one in both the brain and the spinal cord is more closely associated with that osseous tissue, the bone, that's protecting both of these central nervous system structures. The word dura mater, translated, means tough mother. I'm not kidding. That's what it means. So not surprisingly, this is a very strong, fibrous covering tissue. All right. So dura mater is going to be, very fibrous, and it's going to be more closely associated with the outermost portion, the bone, okay, that's covering or protecting the spinal cord and the brain. Going in towards the nervous tissue, the next meningeal layer covering is called the arachnoid mater. Right? So what comes to mind when you hear arachnoid? Spider. Yeah, exactly. So it gets its name because I don't know if I have a really good image of it, but it has a tissue layer, and then it has kind of tendrils that extend down. And so that looks like kind of a spider web. And it extends down into this layer that is this covering that is closest to the nervous tissue called the pia mater. Right? Okay? Now, pia mater, right, is literally translated as gentle mother. So it's very, it's going to be very delicate, and it's connected strongly to the nervous tissue. Right? So here, the dura mater is connected more to the osseous tissue. Pia mater is more connected to the nervous tissue, and in between we have the arachnoid mater. Right? That there's going to be a space between where we have the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Right? So we can call this the subarachnoid space. Okay? And so you can see some of these, on the spinal cord image over here on the right. And all 3 of these together are called meninges. All right? All 3 of these together. All right. Gray matter. So if we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we have both gray and white matter. So who remembers what distinguishes between, how we can distinguish, or what anatomical features or cell structures are part of gray matter versus white matter? Let's start with the question, what generates white matter? Anybody remember? Myelin, yeah, exactly. So myelin generates white matter. So what part of a neuron are you going to find in white matter? So we'll do it multiple choice. Dendrites, soma, axon? Which one of those would you most likely find in white matter? So I heard axons. You are correct. Yeah. Because which one of those is myelinated? The axons, right? Okay. So it turns out the white matter contains primarily axons, myelinated axons. Remember that not all axons are myelinated, right? And what about gray matter? What part of those neurons would you expect to find in gray matter? What do you guys think? Would we expect to find myelinated axons there? No? So what's left? Yeah, the soma, and where are we receiving information into the neuron? Dendrites, right? So basically what we're talking about is, all right, well, most of what we find here in the gray matter are going to be a lot of soma and dendrites, so there's a higher population of those there in gray matter. And then the white matter, we're going to find more of the myelinated axons. Right? Now, one of the things with the spinal cord here is you kind of have to remember the spinal cord, we're having basically these neurons that are running up and down the spinal cord. All right? They're running up and down the spinal cord. And what we've done is taken a cross section here. So some of these neurons are going inferior and superior, right? And so what we did is we kind of did a cross section, and so we kind of cut through some of those myelinated axons, right? So here, this white matter has myelinated axons that are going up and down, right? In some cases, we have information coming in, okay? And remember, the gray matter, and this is going to be something that you want to remember because we're going to run into this with the brain anatomy too. That gray matter, because it's got dendrites and soma, it's where one neuron is sending information on to the next neuron, right? So it's where you have a connection between two or more neurons. And so you can see this on this image where we have connections between neurons. But with the white matter, that's kind of the, express route, if you want to think about it that way. There's no kind of passing off information to another cell. It's going along the axon to whatever its destination is. Once it gets to the destination and it's going to be passing information on to another cell, generally that happens in a cluster area where there's gray matter. Why is it gray? Well, you don't have myelin in that area, right? Because when we talk about synaptic transmission, we have a presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. So we have dendrites, and then we have the axon terminus, and we generally don't have myelin in that area, all right? So where we have two or more neurons communicating with each other, that's generally going to be gray matter. Where we have an express route that's sending information along the axon, that's generally white matter. Everybody with me on that? Because we're going to see the same system in the brain. Okay, so a little bit more orientation here. So this is posterior, and this is anterior. And you notice that here we have neurons that are sending information in. So taking information into the peripheral nervous system, into the central nervous system, in this case, the spinal cord. Sometimes that information needs to be integrated, and so we have a neuron that starts and stops. It's completely housed within the central nervous system. So it's dendrites, cell body, axon terminus, never leave the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord. We call those types of neurons interneurons. right? So they're there to help communicate between different neuron populations in the central nervous system. So when you hear the term interneuron, that's what it's referring to. Right? No part of that neuron is outside of the central nervous system. Okay? All right. So spinal cord, one of the places where we get integration of information. The gray matter itself, remember where we're going to have synapses, is kind of H-shaped. I always think it kind of looks either butterfly or bat-shaped. And so here we talked about that this area, since it's gray matter, is not myelinated. And we know, like we just spent some time talking about, is where we have information being passed from one neuron to another. So if we have sensory information coming into the central nervous system, sensory information coming into the central nervous system, all right, and it's going to be passed off to a neuron within the central nervous system, where is that synapse going to be located? Gray matter or white matter? Gray matter, right? So that's what's happening here in this gray matter area. Now you notice the shape here that we kind of have these points kind of pointing out, and there's one here. So we can call this an anterior, posterior, and this one pointing out towards the side, we can call that lateral. These points, these areas, are referred to as horns. Okay? So we can talk about anterior horn, posterior horn, lateral horn. Now, who remembers other terms for anterior and posterior? It's another term for anterior and posterior. So I heard dorsal's one. What's the other one? Ventral, right? Dorsal and ventral. And I'll tell you why I think it's helpful to remember and talk about these as dorsal and ventral in just a second. All right? So which one would be dorsal? Anterior or posterior? So posterior, right? So we could call this the dorsal horn, right? And then we can call this the ventral horn, right? Lateral just stays the same. So dorsal horn versus ventral horn, okay? All right, but you will see anterior and posterior horn used as well. All right, so why am I saying that it's going to be helpful for you guys to use dorsal and ventral horn? Well, the reason is one of these horns, we have information coming in, sensory information coming in, and remember it gets integrated in the central nervous system. And this other horn is going to be passing off information out towards the peripheral nervous system, so that whatever the plan is that was generated in the central nervous system gets executed. So one of these horns is taking information in, the other one is sending information out from the central nervous system, right? So the mnemonic device to remember which horn is taking information in and which one's sending it out is, which do we need first in order to respond? Sensory information, or do we need a response? So which one comes first? Sensory information, right? If you were to alphabetize dorsal and ventral horn, which one becomes first? Which one comes first? Dorsal. So that one actually is receiving sensory information in, and then in order to execute that, or to relay that that plan that was generating the central nervous system, it's sent out via the ventral horn. So that's the mnemonic device I use to remember which one does which. All right. So we're going to have sensory information coming in a dorsal horn, and then we're going to have that plan that was generated, okay, or the response that was generated in the central nervous system, be sent out via the ventral horn. Or I should say, neurons that originate in the ventral horn. Okay? So not surprisingly, right, if we have information coming in, those are going to have synapses for sensory neurons in the dorsal horn. In order to execute that plan that was generating the central nervous system, we're going to have the synapse for motor neurons in the ventral horn. Okay? Which means motor neurons that extend all the way to skeletal muscle, where is their cell body and dendrites? So where's their cell body and dendrites? They're originating here in the spinal cord. So what part of the spinal cord are they originating in? So ventral horn. Yeah, absolutely. So those motor neurons that you all talked about when we were looking at the skeletal muscle system, right? They start here in that ventral horn. And they exit the spinal cord and make their way all the way to skeletal muscle. So if you damage the spinal cord, right, are you going to compromise the ability of those motor neurons to properly communicate with skeletal muscle? Absolutely. Right? All right, so sensory and then motor neurons. Remember, we just talked about skeletal muscle, but there's other types of responses that are generated from the central nervous system, right? So what are the other two types of muscle tissue? Smooth and, we did skeletal, smooth and cardiac, yeah. So it turns out some of these other neurons that are important for regulating smooth and cardiac muscle, all right, they start off here in the spinal cord, specifically here in the ventral horn, and some of them are going to be starting off, in the lateral horn, okay, right? In fact, a lot of those responses that we have that we're not conscious about, so like we consciously are able to control skeletal muscle, some of those other responses from our central nervous system we're not able to control, those are autonomic neurons that originate in the lateral horn. So they're coming off this little section, all right, of that gray matter. All right, so another term is afferent versus efferent. So you guys remember that a little bit? So afferent versus efferent. So afferent means information's going towards the central nervous system. Efferent means that information is coming away or going away from the central nervous system. So we can talk about pathways. So here, which one is conducting a afferent or taking in afferent information? The dorsal, right? And which one's sending out efferent? The ventral, right? So the mnemonic device, for those that haven't heard those terms before, is it once again A before E. So we have to have afferent before we get an efferent pathway to respond. All right? Does that make any questions on this? Is this making sense to folks? Right? So one of the things to keep in mind is which way is information flowing. In order to respond to something, we have to know what that something is, right? We have to integrate that information. We'll see this same type of setup when we talk about the brain. So keep this in mind. Okay. So we're going to move a little bit further out from the spinal cord. So here, we're getting into the peripheral nervous system. As soon as we exit the spinal cord, we're getting to the peripheral nervous system. So here, we're going to have, this is our dorsal horn, okay? Which means, which way is information flowing along this, what we call a route? So which way is information flowing? Is it coming in to the spinal cord, or is this information being sent out? So why do you guys say in? Dorsal, yeah, and so is this going to be sensory information, or is this going to be motor information? Sensory information, right? So here, I know a lot of times we want to think about the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, as being the center, and then everything emanates out from that. But remember, we have to send information into it too, right? And so here, this information's coming in, so it goes through this dorsal root, and then it's going to go into the dorsal horn. Okay? So information's coming in via the dorsal root to the dorsal horn. Now, what about this ventral root? Right? Which way is information going along this pathway? Is it coming out or is it going in? So is it going into the central nervous system or coming out of it? Should be coming out, right? And so here, because it's a ventral root, we're going to have motor neurons coming out that are going to extend all the way to skeletal muscle, for instance. All right? Now you'll see another term here, okay, that's called a ganglion. So any type of clustering of communication between neurons, which we're talking about synapses at this point, right? Where information gets passed from one neuron to the next, right? So that happens at synapses. So a presynaptic neuron has axon terminals. The postsynaptic neuron has what? That's receiving information. So what's that structure? Has the receptors, dendrites, right? And then the dendrites are connected to the soma, right? So that's what's happening at these ganglia, where we have a bunch of cell bodies, okay? Right? So there's a pass-off of information. So here where we have a ganglia is generally where we have a clustering of synapses, which means that we're going to have axon terminals and dendrites together. So would you expect, if you were to dissect this out, would you expect to see white matter or gray matter in this area? Gray matter, right? So generally don't talk about it like that, but yeah, absolutely. Where we have the roots here, and then also coming from this dorsal root ganglion, ganglia is plural, right? We have axons, and if they're myelinated, that would be white matter. So if you take a look at in a dissected cadaver, you can see that some of these axons are white, or some of these nerves are white because of the myelination. Which means that we have kind of a neuron that starts here and brings information in, okay, and then it gets passed off. And then we also have sensory neurons that are bringing information all the way to this point to where it gets passed off, right? So if you think about kind of way stops on the way to the central nervous system, right? The ganglia would be one of those where there's kind of a, transfer or relay, right, from one neuron to the next. Now, information coming out, say from the ventral root, okay? So if it's a motor neuron, it goes all the way to the skeletal muscle. Now, as you go from these roots, eventually they come together into a single nerve, spinal nerve. So it means that if you take a look at these nerves that are far away from the spinal cord, so way down here, do nerves contain only afferent or only efferent information, or both? So if we look at nerves that are kind of further away from the spinal cord, so kind of way down here, what do you think? Both, right? So as you get past these roots, right, that nerve has axons that are conducting information in both directions. Afferent, bringing information towards the central nervous system, and efferent, bringing information towards, or a signal to skeletal muscle in this case, right? So we start off with the separation as we're close to the spinal cord, and then it comes together into a single nerve, but some of that information is going this way, some of that information is coming the other way, right? So the further away we get from the spinal cord, right, once we get past these roots, those nerves have information going in both directions. So there's a common misconception that nerves are only taking information in one direction. That's not true. All right, so that's the point that I want to make sure that you guys understand. All right, so here, dorsal root ganglions, not surprisingly, they're sensory neurons, and because there's a synapse, that's where we have dendrites and cell bodies, like you guys said, right? Makes sense. There's also something called unipolar. Many of these sensory neurons are unipolar, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second for those that don't know what I'm talking about. All right? So unipolar means that we have a cell body here, and that there's one extension from the cell body where they have dendrites on one end and then they have axons on the other. And why is this helpful? Well, it's helpful because you can send information fairly quickly from one end of the neuron to the next, right? It doesn't have to do a lot of integrating, right? Because that's the job of the central nervous system, right? So it's just trying to conduct information as efficiently as possible. So not surprisingly, the dorsal root are sensory neurons. They have sensory axons. And the ventral root is containing mostly the motor neuron axons, right? Hopefully this makes sense for the reasons we talked about. Is this clear to folks? So people understand the difference between roots and horns. I think you got a question? Go ahead. Yeah.
So, you said that the dorsal root takes information to the dorsal horn.
Mm-hmm.
Then does the ventral horn give information to the ventral root?
There actually isn't a, yes. Well, it's going, which direction is it going from, though? So ventral, are we sending information away from? Yes. So it's actually the other way around. The ventral horn is sending information along the ventral root. Right. Yeah. So remember, these are kind of like motor neurons, right? And the cell body of these motor neurons starts here in the ventral horn, and then it is going to send its axons out along here towards, say, the skeletal muscle, right? Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we're going out away, so it's efferent. It's an efferent pathway. And then here we have an afferent pathway. Does that make sense? So, awesome. Any other questions? Is it clear the difference between horns and roots? So roots are going to be outside the spinal cord. Horns are actually part of the spinal cord itself. Okay, so what about the white matter? So the white matter is conducting the information along the spinal cord. And so here we have myelinated axons. And so a cluster of these myelinated axons, all right, in the spinal cord we call tracts. And so this is sending information to different parts of the central nervous system, all right? So here are ways to communicate with information from the peripheral nervous system is sent along the spinal cord towards the brain for further integration in some cases. So we could talk about tracts sending information towards the brain for further integration, which means that is this going to be sensory information? Yes. And then if we have descending tracts sending information along the spinal cord, say away from the brain, what do you think? What type of information is being sent? So efferent, right, which is going to include, say, plans to execute how to move skeletal muscle, for instance, right? Okay. We can also have some cross communication that goes on for coordinating, say, both sides of our body, right? Or having complex movements. So, say, being able to walk. You have to coordinate both your right and your left leg, as well as shifting your body weight, right? And so there's going to be cross information that goes along, and those are transverse tracks. So we have sensory input, and then we have motor output. And transverse tracks is sending information from one side to the other of the spinal cord. Okay? So those are the major types of tracks that we're going to be talking about. Yeah?
It creates a lot of trauma on the right leg, for instance. It will actually drop your left leg. Is that where you're getting at?
If you damage the transverse tracks, then you have difficulty with coordination, right? I think that's maybe what you're going for, a little bit, yeah. But yeah, when we get to reflexes, then it may make a little bit more sense. All right. Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about here. We can have ascending tracks that are going up. So here we have information coming in. So what type of information is this? Is this going to be sensory information? Yes. Hopefully you're able to convince yourself that that's true. So we have sensory information coming in. We have, the cell bodies, and then that's going to send information. In some cases you have synapses in here, okay, that are going to send information into the dorsal horn, and then they're going to continue up these tracks, and they're going to pass information off at certain areas. Their destination is going to be a lot of times in the brain. In some cases, the destination is to some other place in the spinal cord, and then it's relayed to another neuron that is continuing that information to the brain. All right. We can also have descending tracks. So here we're going to have part of our brain that is formulating the plan, and another part of our brain that's taking that plan and integrating information and sending that plan out to be executed. And so that information that's coming down through the spinal cord in order for it to get execution of that plan are going to be descending tracks. In some cases, we need to have coordination between, say, both sides of our body. And so some of that information gets passed from one side of the spinal cord to the next. And so that's a transverse. That's going to be using a transverse type of track. Okay. All right, so some of these tracks, they have specific names. Not surprisingly, right, you can tell something about those tracks, which way they're going. So if we have the name, generally the first part of the name is giving you the origin and then the destination. So if you know where it starts and where it ends, hopefully you can figure out which direction it's going. If you know the direction it's going, then you know that it could be, it's either sensory or motor, right? So here, if we have spinal thalamic, spino is referring to, what's that origin? In the spine, and the thalamus is actually in the brain. So which direction are we heading? Are we going towards the brain or away from the brain? Towards the brain in this case, right? Which means, is this carrying sensory information or motor information? Sensory information, right? So this is actually taking information towards the brain, which means that this is going to be an afferent pathway. And so here, some other ones, let's take a look at. So, another one. So spinocerebellar. So spinocerebellar. So is that going to be sensory or motor, do you think? sensory, right? So cerebellum's part of the brain. No, we haven't covered anatomy of the brain yet, but you should know that spinal is always referring to the spine. Okay? Let's see. Let's do another one. See, over here. So here, reticulospinal. Reticulospinal. So, is that sensory or motor information? Motor, right? So I know you guys don't know where the reticular formation is in the brain because we haven't talked about brain anatomy, but you know that the destination here is spinal, right? So it's starting here in the reticular formation, which is in the brain, and going towards the spine, which means that information flow is heading out. So here we're going to get some sort of motor information in this tract, right? So vestibulospinal, right? So is that motor or sensory? So motor again, okay? So here, a lot of the names for these tracts help you determine the direction and therefore what type of information that's going along those tracts. Now, not all tracts are named, in this case, like that, unfortunately, but a lot of them are, right? And so anytime you have this type of naming, you should be able to determine which way is this information going, and that's going to help you understand, or is it sensory information or motor information? Sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
Is there any extra word element in this, or
Not too much. Yeah, the word for crossing over like that, where you get information that's coming from one side of the brain and then crosses over to the other, that crossing over, the word for that is called decussation. So I'll write that on the board in just a second. All right? And you can't really tell by the name, of where that occurs. I will say that most of the descending tracts for the motor skeletal muscle, right, do decussate, meaning that they cross over, which means controlling your left hand, that program to do that started on the right side of your brain. Okay? So there is crossing over that occurs. There's decussation, we say. Right? Some of that crossing over happens in the spinal cord. Some of it happens in the part of the brain called the brain stem. Okay? Right? And so we're not going to go into, a lot of the details about that, but it does happen. Right? Okay? So why don't we take a break? And what we'll do, after the break is continue our discussion, and then during the break I'll write decussation up on the board. So the next part is to talk a little bit about receptors. We're going to talk in more detail about some of the receptors a little bit later in the course, especially when we get to special senses. We're going to have specialized receptors like for vision and hearing and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit more detail about some of these specialized organs and receptors then. But remember the flow here, of information coming from those receptors along sensory neurons into the central nervous system. It gets integrated. In some cases, that integration is really quick. So reflexes, right, which we'll talk about after, shortly here. All right, and then that information's sent out towards effectors. In some cases, that could be skeletal muscle. In some cases, that could be smooth muscle. In some cases, that could be cardiac muscle. In some cases, it's going to be glands, right? For skeletal muscle, we generally have conscious control over that, but in some cases, such as the knee-jerk reflex, right? That is going to be a reflex that we don't have control over, so there's some actual, integration that goes on in areas of the central nervous system that bypasses, the part of the brain that is integrating and sending out information that, the plan is consciously executed, right? So here we're going to talk about reflexes, which are going to be kind of more unconscious and automatic, And so we'll talk about the pathways that are involved with those types of reflexes or those types of responses. right? So remember, we have the sensory division and the motor division, and the effectors can be skeletal muscle or any type of muscle or glands. So sensory input can come in through, all of these different types of nerves. So we have receptors, various types, that detect various types of stimuli. So we have receptors that are detecting stretch and pressure and different chemicals, also temperature and so forth. And so special types of receptor organs, such as our eyes, we'll talk about a little bit later. We also have somatic. Somatic generally refers to skeletal muscle, so anytime you hear the word somatic, you should think skeletal muscle, conscious control. So if we talk about a somatic motor neuron, we're talking about basically just a motor neuron. Visceral. So what do I mean by visceral? Yeah, organs, basically, so basically, we're talking about information that comes from, do I have food in my stomach, for instance, right? Okay, so that information, a lot of that, is coming from viscera, which are organs in our thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity a lot of times, right? And so think about where these are found, right? So special we talked about a little bit, somatic, they're going to be found. So skeletal muscle, but does skeletal muscle directly attach to bone? So what's that tissue that goes from the skeletal muscle to bone? What's that called? Tendons. Yeah, exactly. So it turns out that there's gonna be some sensors in tendons that detect stretch of the tendon, for instance. Okay. Now, how do you know where your hand is in three-dimensional space? Right? So one of the ways that's done is because there's sensory information that's coming in about where's your hand. If you're going to go pick up, say, a glass of water or a cup, for instance, how do you know where to put your hand to do that? Well, there's got to be some sort of three-dimensional information coming that way. How do you know how strongly to grip, what you want to pick up, right? So that all has to be sensory information coming in. So with a lot of the sensory information that comes in, you don't even think about it. It just happens, right? It's all part of the master plan that got sent out to go and write whatever you're writing down or pick up whatever you're picking up, right? So. Yes. Yeah, so here, where are these found? A lot of them, right? Skin, eyes, ears, mouth, nose. Muscles and tendons, you can lump those under the somatic heading. That's fine. And then visceral organs, like you guys said, a lot of these guys, are going to be in the abdominal pelvic. Turns out there's a lot of network of neurons around our intestinal tract. So it's called the enteric nervous system. Very, very complicated. It's a complex network, and sometimes it's referred to as a second brain. It's so complicated. Because we have to have these reflexes, things that you don't think about, to move food through the digestive tract. So think how onerous it would be if you had to remember to move food from the stomach into the intestines, and then from one section of the intestine to the next, to the next, to the next. It would consume a lot of your time and energy and brain power to do that. So it happens kind of automatically. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the digestive system. All right, so types of receptors, are going to be detecting a variety of things. So here are thermoreceptors. Not surprisingly, what do you think these guys are detecting? Temperature, right? And that means elevated or decreased temperature. And then chemoreceptors, what do you guys think those receptors are detecting? What's that? Say it again. The chemoreceptors? You saying length? Or light? Oh, not light. Those would be which ones? Photoreceptors, right? Okay. Chemoreceptors. So various chemicals. For instance, if you guys remember a hypo versus hyper versus isotonic, our cells don't do so well, if we have, say, a hypotonic solution or a hypertonic solution in our blood. So one of the ways that that's altered is by, say, salt concentration, right? So one of the types of receptors that's a chemoreceptor that detects that is going to be detecting salt concentrations. So that type of receptor is a chemoreceptor, so it detects chemicals. Right? So nociceptors, anybody know what those are detecting? Pain, right? So nociception is pain, right? Detection of pain. A lot of the pain sensations come from tissue being damaged. And when tissue gets damaged, it releases chemicals, and the receptors bind to those chemicals and relay information in the form of pain, right? So anybody remember one of the neurotransmitters that's important? Yep, substance P. Yep. So that's one of the major chemicals that's binding to neurotransmitter receptor, substance P receptor, sending pain information, right? Okay. All right, mechanoreceptors. So what are they detecting? What do you guys think? So not necessarily movement. So, if we're talking about the movement, what type of movement? You want to expand that? Stretch. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, that's the word we're looking for. Yeah, so stretch, right? So stretching is a big one. So anytime we have stretching or some sort of physical impact, these receptors can detect that. So what are some places where we have stretching going on? What's that? Skin. So there's a few there, right? There's a few there. One of the other ones is, what about our heart that pumps blood? So when that heart squeezes blood into blood vessels, what do you think happens to the diameter of those blood vessels? So they dilate, right? They get larger. So what happens to those walls? Are they stretching? Absolutely. And so here we can have some mechanoreceptors there that are sensing that stretch, sending information, right? So that's another place where we can find these. So here, some visuals. So here, another place where we have chemoreceptors, is in the nose. So odorants, being able to detect chemicals. Those odorants are chemicals that bind to specific receptors in our nose. All right? Let's see. So here's a zoomed up portion, I think over here. And then let's take a look. So these are photoreceptors, so the back of your eye. Okay, and we'll talk more about these guys when we get to special senses. All right, so back of the eye. And then a lot of the thermal receptors, chemoreceptors, and nociceptors we can find in our skin, and as well as other places. Right? Does that make sense to folks, these terms, and what type of information they're gathering to send so that there's a response? Okay, so some of these mechanoreceptors, ones that we find in the muscles and tendons, we call these proprioceptors specifically. They're detecting stretch and movement. So they're kind of like, an indicator that's sandwiched in with the muscles. So if the muscle stretches, these stretch, right, and send information. They're basically just monitoring what's happening at the muscles, all right? And so that's helping because it prevents overstretching the muscles. Also, we have some of these same types of structures in tendons, right? So GTOs, all right, are going to be part of tendons in order for make sure we don't get overstretching of the tendons, right? And so here, remember, tendons, they don't have the contractility, right? So we don't want to have overstretching there, right? And so both of these, are sending information so that you can execute what may seem like a simple task that takes a lot of information into account for it to occur. So here, the motor output from that sensory information could be motor neurons, so that's going to be happening from the spinal and cranial nerves. Effectors, so effectors are going to be anything that is going to receive that information from the central nervous system. So when we talk about somatic effectors at skeletal muscle, autonomic ones, whenever we say autonomic, it's going to be without our conscious control of it. So that can be glands, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, the visceral organs like we talked about, right? And so here, when we get to autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk more about these kind of autonomic effectors. Right, so here, if we look at the motor division, we have the somatic, which is skeletal muscle. Autonomic is going to be more of those things that we don't have conscious control over: glands, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. All right, so just as a quick summary at this point, looking at the central versus peripheral nervous system. Okay, remember the central nervous system is anatomically composed of brain and spinal cord, and we talked about some major structures there that make up the spinal cord. And we can divide that up into gray matter and white matter, and hopefully it makes sense to you what the which way information is going along the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is anything that's going to be out of the brain and spinal cord, so that includes spinal nerves and roots. And so the dorsal root ganglion, so DRG, and then the ventral root, and then also some of these nerves, the sensory neurons, they're receptors and motor neurons, right? Okay? Because the next step is to try to integrate this information into what we call reflexes. So do you consciously think about reflexes? No, they just happen, right? So simple reflex arc, okay? So here a reflex arc, we get information from some receptor, it comes into the central nervous system, and then we have some sort of response. So unless it gets to certain parts of our brain, we're not conscious of it. It just happens, right? It's kind of like, having a pre-programmed response, right, to certain sensory inputs. A lot of times, that sensory information comes in, and then it gets routed to a efferent motor pathway via an interneuron. So here, when the skeletal muscle is the effector, this is a somatic reflex. All right, yeah, go ahead.
The reflexes are always going to be that faster than processing.
Yeah. Generally, I can't think of a situation where it's not. Yeah, bless you. All right, so you guys probably are familiar with a little hammer. You tap on, a physician taps on, the little part of your knee below the kneecap, and what happens to your leg? It shoots up, right? Do you think about that happening? If you try to prevent it, which I've tried, all right, are you able to prevent it? No, it just happens, right? So that's a simple reflex arc. No matter how much I tried as a kid to stop it, it happened, despite my best efforts, right? So what is happening in this situation? Well, the little tap with the hammer, what is that doing? Well, it's going right on the tendon there. And so if you are pushing on that tendon, you're stretching that tendon a little bit, right? You're stretching that tendon a little bit. which is sending that tendon stretch back to the central nervous system, right? Back to the spinal cord. Now, normally tendons get stretched when what pulls on it? Muscle, right? So did the muscle get stretched in this case? Did it contract? No. We kind of mimicked that, right? So here we get that stretch, and we get stretch there of our muscle that's detected, okay? Right? Because of the hammer hitting the tendon. That's sent that sensory information to the spinal cord. And so the response is, oh, this muscle is being stretched. In order to minimize that overstretching, what does it do? It's going to contract, right? In order to minimize that overstretching, it's going to contract. So we mimicked overstretching, and there's a reflex arc. So you're not consciously thinking, oh, wow, there's overstretching going on around my knee, I should contract my quadriceps. No, that just happens, right? So here's this reflex arc comes along, that sensory information comes in. In some cases, you do get an interneuron, sometimes you don't. And it sends that information back out to the appropriate muscle in order to get contraction, or to minimize the overstretching, right? Did any part of this reflex arc make it to the higher places in our brain? No. So there's no way for us to kind of control what ends up happening with this reflex arc. Does that make sense to folks? Right? So the whole point here is to minimize overstretching, and notice here that we're talking about a single synapse, right? A single synapse. So this is called monosynaptic. So if the response was to have multiple outputs, then that would be polysynaptic. All right? So here we have muscle spindles, right, that are activated. They're sending sensory information. Remember what part of that spinal cord gray matter is it coming into? It's going to be the dorsal horn, and it's going to go through what root? The dorsal root, right? Okay? And then it is going to be integrated. In this case, it's very quickly integrated, and you're going to have a information sent out towards the skeletal muscle to correct for the mimicked overstretching that goes on, right? Everybody following the general order of events for a simple arc? Okay, so here this is a somatic one. So what about if you get something that's hot? So generally you don't have to think about pulling your hand away. It just happens really, really quickly, right? You know, here thermal receptors detect something that's hot. Sometimes also nociceptors are going to be detecting there's damage. So that information is once again routed to your spinal cord. And here, information is sent out to those muscles to retract your hand away from something that's hot. But also information gets sent to the brain telling you that, oh, something is hot over here. Or also that, oh, you've done some tissue damage, right? Okay? So here, not only do we have a somatic reflex response, but we have information also being routed to the brain for conscious integration, right? And some of that gets hopefully stored as a memory, right? That, oh, I shouldn't touch something that's hot in the future, right? So hopefully, you know, that gets integrated then, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So they don't really touch something hot, you actually push into it too before you actually let go.
Not sure exactly why. You know, maybe to push it away is my guess, but I don't know.
I didn't know it was a reflex at all. You have like time yourself to do it, so you actually push into it.
Oh,
while you
consciously?
like, do it faster.
Not sure. Never heard that one. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. So So here, this one is polysynaptic, right? Because here we have more than one information being routed in more than one direction from here, right? Okay. Now, the last one we'll talk about is something I think is kind of cool. It's called a cross extensor reflex. So if you're walking around and you step on something sharp, right, what do? You end up withdrawing your leg from that something that's sharp, right? Okay. But if you withdraw your leg, that means you're standing on your other leg, right? So there has to be quick coordination between you withdrawing one leg and then being prepared to bear weight on your other leg, right? That has to happen fairly quickly. And so that's something that is called a cross-extensor reflex, where we get information coming in from one side of our body, and that information not only gets sent to the brain that, oh, I shouldn't step in that area anymore because there's something sharp and hurtful, but also to quickly pull up your one leg and then fire muscles so that you can carry the weight on your other leg. So if you guys are interested, you can mimic this in the lab, and I can show you guys how, all right, with your hands. All right, so it turns out you can do this cross-extensor reflex, with your hands. It's a little bit tricky, and sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it works better than others, All right? Okay. So here, when we talk about information that's staying on the same side, okay, we call it ipsilateral, right? So we're saying that the leg that was withdrawn was the ipsilateral leg. The one that was prepared to bear weight, right, was the contralateral, opposite side. We're going to use this terminology again, when we talk about the brain, right? So remember we mentioned about decussation, where you have crossing over, where the right side of your brain is controlling kind of the left side of your body, like your left arm, okay? So here we could say, this is the contralateral control of the right side of our brain, okay? If we're controlling the same side, then it would be ipsilateral, right? So some terminology. Okay. All right. So I think that's about it for today, okay? Once again, this is just all somatic reflexes that we pretty much talked about, all right? Okay. So we'll leave it there. And be sure to go through, and there's some kind of interesting clips to take a look at here, and go through and review the information that we talked about today, because we do have an in-class quiz next Wednesday. And for those that didn't hear my announcement at the beginning of class, be sure to review stuff from the first quiz, because there's a good chance in the future, like the next in-class quiz, you'll have an opportunity to redeem yourself. So be sure to understand GPCRs and kind of how, neurotransmission and neurotransmitters are cleaned up. All right? And I'll see you guys at around 10 o'clock. I'll open up the lab.